Have you ever walked past a house and thought, that garden looks expensive? Maybe you slowed your car down, or you stopped mid-walk just to take it in. The strange part is that most of the time, that garden did not cost a fortune. It was not filled with rare imported plants, or a professional budget in the tens of thousands. It was built with a handful of affordable plants that landscape designers use again and again because of the feeling those plants create. Today, I am going to show you the 7 plants behind that expensive look. These are plants you can buy at almost any garden center, most of them for less than the cost of a dinner out. But once you understand why they work, you will never look at a garden the same way again. And stick around for the final plant on this list, because it creates what I call the entrance effect. A single planting choice that can change the entire first impression of a home the moment someone walks up to the door. Here is the truth that most beginner gardeners never hear. Expensive-looking gardens are almost never about which individual plant costs the most. They are about 6 design principles working together: structure, texture, repetition, color, layers, and focal points. A landscape designer walks into a blank yard and does not think, "What beautiful flower should I buy?" They think, "What feeling do I want someone to have when they walk through this space? Do I want them to feel calm, like they have stepped into a Mediterranean resort? Do I want them to feel like they have wandered into a lush storybook cottage? Do I want their eyes to be pulled toward a doorway the second they arrive?" Once you start thinking this way, you stop shopping for pretty plants, and you start shopping for effects. That single shift in thinking is the real secret behind gardens that look far more expensive than they actually were. So here is a question for you. Which plant do you think makes a garden feel the most luxurious? Drop your guess in the comments before we get into the list. I would love to see if it matches what is coming up. And if this kind of practical, no-fluff garden design content is useful to you, consider subscribing and hitting the bell button to get notified, because we break down a new affordable design secret every single week. Let's get into the first plant, because it is responsible for one of the most recognizable looks in high-end garden design. Plant 7, Hydrangea. Botanical name, Hydrangea macrophylla, and related species. Common name, Hydrangea. If you have ever seen a garden that looks like it belongs in a magazine spread, one packed with soft, rounded blooms the size of a dinner plate, spilling over a fence or lining a walkway, there is a very good chance you are looking at hydrangeas. Here is why they create such an expensive impression. It comes down to a single design concept called volume. Our brains associate fullness with abundance, and abundance reads as luxury. A garden bed that looks sparse and thin reads as neglected or unfinished, even if every plant in it is healthy. A garden bed packed with big, round, generous blooms reads as intentional, cared for, and expensive, even if it cost almost nothing. Hydrangeas deliver that fullness better than almost any other affordable plant. Their flower clusters, called mopheads or lace caps depending on the variety, can grow larger than a human head, and a single mature shrub can produce dozens of them in one season. Designers use hydrangeas as what is called a statement plant, meaning one plant does the visual work that would otherwise require 5 or 6 smaller plants crowded together. Where should you plant them? Hydrangeas do best near the corners of a house, along a shaded fence line, or grouped in odd numbers, 3 or 5, along a walkway. Odd numbers matter here, because even numbers can look artificially arranged, while odd numbers feel more natural and organic, which is part of what makes designer gardens feel effortless instead of forced. Most hydrangea varieties prefer partial shade, especially protection from harsh afternoon sun, and they want soil that holds moisture without staying soggy. If you are in a hot climate, morning sun with afternoon shade is ideal. They do surprisingly well in large containers too, which makes them a great option if you only have a patio or a small entryway rather than a full yard. Now for the honest part. Hydrangeas are thirsty plants. Their large leaves lose moisture quickly, and in hot weather, you may need to water them several times a week. The most common beginner mistake is planting them in full, unshaded afternoon sun, which causes the blooms to wilt dramatically by mid-afternoon, even when the plant is otherwise healthy. Another common mistake is pruning at the wrong time of year and accidentally cutting off next year's flower buds, so always check whether your variety blooms on old wood or new wood before you trim. If you are on a tight budget, you do not need 5 hydrangea shrubs. 1 or 2 well-placed shrubs, allowed to grow to their full size, will create more visual impact than several small, crowded ones. That is the first lesson in expensive-looking design. Fewer plants, given room to become their full, generous selves, almost always look better than many small plants packed in tightly. But the next plant creates a completely different luxury feeling, one that is less about fullness and more about atmosphere. Plant 6. Lavender. Botanical name: Lavandula angustifolia and related species. Common name: lavender. Close your eyes for a second and imagine walking down a stone path in the south of France, or through the courtyard of a boutique hotel, somewhere warm and sun-soaked. There is a good chance that in your imagination, there is a soft haze of silvery purple blooms lining that path, and a faint herbal fragrance in the air. That is lavender, and it might be the single most effective plant for creating what feels like a high-end resort atmosphere, for the price of a few dollars a plant. Lavender's luxury effect works on 2 senses at once, which is rare and powerful in garden design. Visually, its soft gray-green foliage and repeating spikes of purple flowers create a calm, cohesive look that photographs beautifully and never feels chaotic. But it is the fragrance that does the real emotional work. Scent is one of the most powerful triggers for memory and emotion, and lavender's calming, slightly sweet herbal smell is subconsciously associated with spas, relaxation, and vacation destinations. When guests walk past lavender brushing against a pathway, they are not just seeing your garden, they are experiencing it, and that sensory layer is exactly what expensive design spaces provide. The other secret here is repetition. Professional designers rarely plant a single lavender bush and call it done. They plant it in a row, often lining an entire walkway or forming a low border along a patio. Repetition of the same plant, spaced evenly, creates a sense of intentional design that reads as professional. The same way a row of matching lampposts along a street feels more designed than a single random one. Lavender wants full sun, at least 6 hours a day, and it actually prefers poor to average soil that drains extremely well. This is one of the rare cases where a plant thrives on being slightly neglected. Rich, moist soil is actually one of the fastest ways to kill lavender, since it makes the roots prone to rot. Water it sparingly once established, and resist the urge to fertilize heavily. The most common mistake beginners make is treating lavender like a typical flower bed plant, giving it rich compost and frequent watering. It responds by growing leggy, flopping over, and eventually rotting at the base. The second common mistake is planting it in partial shade, where it survives but never produces the dense, fragrant blooms that make it worth growing in the first place. For a budget-friendly approach, buy small starter plants rather than mature ones. Lavender grows quickly once established, and a $2 starter plant can fill out into a substantial, fragrant border within a single growing season. This is where professional gardens start looking different from average ones, because the next plant on our list has nothing to do with flowers at all. Plant 5. Ornamental grasses. Botanical names vary by type. Common examples include Pennisetum, Miscanthus, and Panicum. Common name, ornamental grasses. Most beginners focus on flowers, but professional designers know a secret that separates amateur gardens from designer ones. Movement and texture matter just as much as color, and sometimes more. Ornamental grasses are the plant world's answer to that principle. They sway in the breeze, they catch late afternoon light in a way that almost glows, and they add a soft, textured backdrop that makes every flowering plant around them look more intentional. Here is why this matters so much for the expensive garden look. A garden made entirely of flowers, no matter how beautiful, can start to feel busy or even chaotic, especially to an untrained eye. Ornamental grasses act as a visual resting point. They give the eye somewhere calm to land between bursts of color, the same way a designer uses negative space in a room. Without that resting point, a garden can feel cluttered rather than curated. With it, even a modest planting looks composed and deliberate, like something out of a design magazine. Grasses also solve a problem most beginners do not think about, which is seasonal interest. Many flowering plants bloom for a few weeks and then sit there as plain green foliage for months. Ornamental grasses often look striking for 3 full seasons, developing feathery seed heads in late summer and fall, and some varieties even hold their color and structure through winter, when almost everything else in the garden has gone dormant. That means your garden keeps its designed, expensive look far longer than a garden built purely around flowering plants. Designers frequently use grasses in repetition, planting the same variety in a sweeping line or a loose cluster, which creates rhythm the same way lavender does, but with a softer, more naturalistic feel. This is often called a prairie style or naturalistic planting style, and it is one of the fastest-growing trends in high-end landscape design, precisely because it looks expensive while requiring relatively little maintenance. Most ornamental grasses want full sun and are remarkably tolerant of poor soil, drought, and neglect once established, which makes them one of the lowest maintenance plants on this entire list. They also do well in containers, especially taller varieties, used as a dramatic centerpiece on a patio. The main mistake beginners make with grasses is cutting them back at the wrong time or too aggressively, removing structure that actually looks beautiful through fall and winter. Most ornamental grasses only need to be cut back once, in late winter or very early spring, before new growth begins. But structure is not just about softness and movement. The next plant on our list brings something completely different to the table, and it is one of the oldest tricks in formal garden design. Plant 4, boxwood. Botanical name, Buxus sempervirens and related varieties. Common name, boxwood. If you have ever walked through the grounds of a historic estate, a 5-star hotel entrance, or a formal European-style garden, you have almost certainly seen boxwood, whether you noticed it consciously or not. Boxwood is the plant most responsible for what people describe as a formal, high-end, manicured look, and it achieves that effect through something surprisingly simple: evergreen structure. Here is the key insight. Flowers come and go with the seasons, but boxwood stays green and full all year round. That means a garden built around boxwood never has an off-season, never looks bare in winter, and never has that awkward transition period between one flower fading and the next one blooming. This year-round consistency is a huge part of what separates a garden that looks professionally maintained from one that looks seasonal and inconsistent. Boxwood also creates luxury through symmetry, which is one of the oldest tricks in formal design. A pair of matching boxwood shrubs flanking a front door, or a low boxwood hedge outlining a flower bed, creates a sense of order and intentionality. Our brains are naturally drawn to symmetry, and read it as polished and high-end, which is exactly why hotels, government buildings, and luxury estates have used clipped boxwood hedges for centuries. Boxwood prefers partial to full sun and well-drained soil, and it is relatively slow-growing, which is actually an advantage for maintenance, since it does not need constant trimming to hold its shape. A light shaping once or twice a year is usually enough for most home gardens. If you live somewhere with harsh winters or boxwood blight is a concern in your region, there are excellent alternatives that create the same evergreen, structured effect, including dwarf holly, inkberry, or certain compact yew varieties. The visual effect matters more than the exact species, so choose whichever evergreen shrub thrives reliably in your specific climate and growing zone. The most common mistake with boxwood is planting it too close together or too close to a structure, not accounting for its mature width, which leads to constant aggressive pruning just to keep it in bounds. Give it appropriate spacing from the start, and you will spend far less time maintaining it later. Boxwood also does beautifully in containers, especially clipped into simple rounded or cone shapes flanking an entryway, for a formal look on even the smallest patio. Now let's talk about a plant that solves one of the biggest challenges in garden design, keeping color going for months without spending a fortune. Plant 3. Salvia. Botanical name, Salvia nemorosa, and related varieties. Common name, salvia, sometimes called meadow sage. One of the most common mistakes beginner gardeners make is buying plants purely because they look beautiful in the pot at the garden center, without asking how long that beauty will actually last once it is in the ground. Many flowering plants put on a spectacular show for 2 or 3 weeks and then go quiet for the rest of the season. Salvia solves this problem better than almost any other affordable perennial, and that is exactly why professional designers rely on it so heavily. Salvia produces tall spikes of purple, blue, or pink flowers, and with regular deadheading, meaning simply trimming off the spent flower spikes, it will rebloom again and again from late spring all the way through the first frost in many climates. That means a single, inexpensive salvia plant can provide months of consistent color, which delivers far more visual value per dollar spent than a plant that blooms once and then sits green for the rest of the season. This is a design principle worth remembering on its own. When you are choosing plants on a budget, ask yourself how many weeks of visual impact you are getting for the price, not just how good the plant looks on the day you buy it. Repeat bloomers like salvia consistently win that comparison, which is exactly why they show up in professional designs again and again. Salvia also happens to be one of the best plants for attracting bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds, which adds a layer of movement and life to a garden that static plants simply cannot provide. A garden that visibly buzzes with pollinators, feels alive and cared for in a way that quietly signals thoughtful design. Plant salvia in full sun for the strongest bloom production, in well-drained soil, and space plants roughly 12 to 18 inches apart so they can form a fuller, more continuous-looking drift rather than isolated clumps. Salvia is drought-tolerant once established, needing only occasional deep watering, and it requires very little fertilizer to perform well. The main mistake with salvia is skipping the deadheading step. Without it, the plant will still bloom, but the flowering period shortens considerably, and the plant can start to look leggy and untidy by midsummer. A few minutes with pruning shears every couple of weeks is a small price to pay for months of continuous color. We are getting close to the final 2 plants now, and the next one might be the most underrated plant on this entire list, because most beginners overlook it completely. Plant 2, Hosta. Botanical name, Hosta species and hybrids. Common name, Hosta. Here is a design secret that surprises almost every beginner gardener the first time they hear it. Foliage can look more expensive than flowers. It sounds counterintuitive since most people associate luxury gardens with color and blooms, but shady, richly layered gardens filled with large, bold leaves create a sense of depth, calm, and richness that flowers alone often cannot achieve, especially in areas that do not get strong direct sunlight. Hostas are the workhorse plant behind this effect. Their large, often heart-shaped leaves come in an enormous range of colors and patterns, from deep blue-green to bright chartreuse to variegated combinations of green and white or green and gold. Planted in generous clusters beneath trees or along a shaded fence, hostas create the kind of lush, layered look you would expect from an established English woodland garden, and they do it in spaces where sun-loving flowers would simply fail to thrive. The key design principle here is texture contrast. Designers rarely plant just one hosta variety. They combine large, smooth-leaved varieties with smaller, more heavily textured ones, and often mix in a fine-textured plant like a fern alongside them. This contrast between big and small, smooth and textured, is what makes a shade garden feel intentional and rich rather than simply green and empty. A monotone patch of identical leaves reads as filler, while a thoughtfully contrasted combination reads as curated design. Hostas want partial to full shade and rich, moist, well-drained soil. They are remarkably low maintenance once established, requiring little more than consistent moisture and an occasional feeding in spring. They also grow beautifully in containers, making them an excellent option for a shaded patio or apartment balcony that never gets much direct sun. The most common mistake with hostas has nothing to do with sun or water. It is slugs and snails, which are notorious for chewing visible holes through hosta leaves. If you notice ragged holes appearing, that is almost always the culprit, and there are several effective, low-cost organic controls available at any garden center. The second common mistake is planting a single hosta alone in an empty bed, where it looks lonely rather than lush. Hostas create their expensive effect through generous clustering, not isolation. For a budget approach, buy a few small starter hostas and divide them every few years as they mature. A single hosta clump can often be split into 3 or 4 new plants after just 2 or 3 growing seasons, essentially multiplying your investment for free. And now we have arrived at the final plant on this list, the one I promised you at the very beginning of this video, the plant responsible for what I call the entrance effect. Plant 1, climbing rose. Botanical name, rosa, climbing varieties such as New Dawn or climbing iceberg. Common name, climbing rose. Think about the most romantic, most expensive-looking home entrance you have ever seen in a photograph or a movie. There is a very good chance it involved a rose-covered archway, a trellis climbing up beside a front door, or a fence disappearing under a cascade of blooms. That image, more than almost any other single plant choice, is what people describe as looking expensive, elegant, and intentional, and it comes from something surprisingly accessible, the climbing rose. Here is the design principle at work. Most beginner gardens stay entirely at ground level, with everything planted in flat beds along the edges of a yard. Climbing roses introduce verticality, pulling the eye upward and making a space feel larger, taller, and far more dramatic than a flat planting ever could. This is sometimes called vertical gardening, and it is one of the fastest ways to transform an ordinary wall, fence, or entrance into a genuine focal point. That focal point effect matters enormously for what people perceive as an expensive garden. Professional designers know that a garden does not need to be uniformly beautiful in every corner. It needs 1 or 2 genuinely stunning focal points that draw the eye and create an emotional reaction, with everything else supporting that centerpiece. A climbing rose trained over a doorway or along an entrance path does exactly that. It becomes the single image a visitor remembers, the detail they compliment, the reason they say your home looks like something from a magazine. Climbing roses need something to climb, whether that is a trellis, an arbor, a pergola, or simply wires attached to a fence or wall, since unlike vines, they do not attach themselves and need to be gently tied in as they grow. They want full sun, at least 6 hours a day, and well-drained, reasonably fertile soil. Regular watering during the first year, while roots establish, is important, but established climbing roses are fairly resilient. For beginners, choosing the right variety matters enormously. Look for disease-resistant varieties, bred specifically for lower maintenance, since some older rose varieties are notoriously prone to fungal issues and can be discouraging for a first-time grower. A local garden center can usually point you toward varieties proven to perform well in your specific growing zone and climate. The most common mistake is planting a climbing rose and then never actually training it onto its support. Left alone, the canes sprawl in every direction and never create that clean, dramatic vertical line that makes the entrance effect work. Spend a few minutes every couple of weeks during the growing season, gently tying new growth to your trellis or arbor, guiding it in the direction you want. For a budget-friendly approach, a single climbing rose over an inexpensive wooden or metal arbor can transform an entire entrance for a fraction of the cost of a full landscaping overhaul, which is exactly why this plant earns the final spot and the biggest visual impact on this list. So there you have it, the 7 affordable plants professional designers rely on to create that unmistakable, expensive garden look. Hydrangeas for fullness and abundance, lavender for a resort-like atmosphere, ornamental grasses for movement and texture, boxwood for formal, year-round structure, salvia for months of color without months of spending, hostas for a rich, layered woodland feeling in the shade, and climbing roses for that unforgettable storybook entrance effect. Notice that not one of these plants is rare, exotic, or expensive on its own. What makes a garden look luxurious is not the price tag of any individual plant. It is understanding the effect each plant creates, and combining structure, texture, repetition, color, layers, and focal points with intention. That is a skill, not a budget, and it is a skill you can start applying in your own yard this weekend. Imagine your neighbor walking by and stopping to ask where you had your garden professionally designed. Imagine guests complimenting your entrance the moment they step out of their car. That reaction is absolutely achievable. On a budget almost anyone can afford, once you understand the principles behind it, rather than just the plants themselves. Of course, success with any of these plants still depends on your specific climate, soil, sunlight, and growing zone, so always check what thrives in your particular region before you buy. A plant that performs beautifully in one part of the country may need a different variety or a bit more care in another. Take the principles from this video and adapt them to what actually grows well where you live. Now that you know the plants that create an expensive-looking garden, the next logical step is learning the design mistakes that can make even genuinely beautiful plants look cheap and thrown together. That video is coming very soon, so if you want to see it the moment it goes live, make sure you are subscribed. Which of these 7 plants are you adding to your garden first? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. I will see you in the next video.